The weight of always being strong, Jasmine Rivera had perfected the art of being everyone's rock. At 29, she had spent 7 years as a trauma counselor at Riverside Community Center, helping broken souls piece their lives back together. She had steady hands during crisis calls, a warm smile for grieving families, and words that could calm the most shattered spirits. What she hadn't mastered was taking care of herself. "You're burning out," her supervisor, Mrs. Patricia, had warned her 3 months ago. "When was the last time you took a real day off?" Jasmine had laughed it off, the same way she laughed off most concerns about her well-being. "I'm fine, Pat. Really, someone has to be here for these people." But fine was the furthest thing from what she actually was. Her mother had died suddenly in January. A heart attack at 54. No warning, no goodbye. Jasmine had held it together through the funeral, the paperwork, the endless phone calls from relatives who suddenly appeared with opinions about everything. She had held it together when her husband of 3 years, Marcus, decided that her grief was too much to handle and filed for divorce 2 weeks after the burial. "You're not the same person I married," he'd said, packing his clothes while she sat numbly on their bed. "You don't laugh anymore. You don't even cry. It's like living with a ghost." Maybe he was right. Maybe she was a ghost of herself, going through the motions of living while everything inside her felt hollow. But she couldn't afford to fall apart. Too many people needed her to be strong. At work, she listened to teenagers talk about their cutting, helped mothers process their children's overdoses, guided families through domestic violence situations. She nodded at all the right moments, offered all the right resources, spoke all the right words of comfort. Then she'd go home to her empty apartment. Marcus had taken most of the furniture and sit in the dark eating cereal for dinner. Her friends had tried reaching out at first. Coffee dates she'd cancel last minute. Phone calls she'd let go to voicemail. Invitations she'd decline with polite excuses about being busy with work. Eventually, they stopped trying. Jasmine told herself she was grateful for the space, but the silence felt like drowning. Sleep had become elusive. She'd lie awake replaying every client session, wondering if she'd said the right things, if she'd helped enough, if she was failing the people who trusted her with their pain. When exhaustion finally pulled her under, she'd dream about her mother, conversations they'd never have, hugs she'd never feel again, the sound of her laugh that was already fading from memory. On this particular Thursday evening, Jasmine sat in her car outside the community center, unable to summon the energy to drive home. She'd just finished a session with a 16-year-old girl whose father had been arrested for abuse, and the weight of holding space for so much pain felt crushing. Her phone buzzed with a text from Patricia asking if she was okay, but Jasmine turned it face down without reading it fully. She looked at herself in the rearview mirror, dark circles under brown eyes that used to sparkle, cheekbones more pronounced from skipped meals, hair pulled back in the same messy bun she'd worn for weeks. When had she become so tired? When had helping others heal become a way of avoiding her own wounds? The parking lot emptied around her as evening fell, but Jasmine remained frozen in her seat, afraid that moving would somehow make everything real. The loneliness, the grief, the fact that the person everyone else leaned on had no one to lean on herself. The unexpected text. 3 days later, Jasmine's phone buzzed during her lunch break, which she wasn't taking, instead choosing to eat a granola bar while reviewing case notes. She glanced at the screen expecting another work-related message, but the name made her pause. Darius Nakamura. She hadn't thought about Darius in over 2 years. They'd been study partners during their graduate program at Pacific University, spending countless late nights in the psychology library, sharing coffee and theoretical discussions about human resilience. He'd been one of those rare people who listened more than he spoke, who asked thoughtful questions that made her think deeper about her own beliefs. While most of their classmates were focused on clinical techniques and diagnostic criteria, Darius seemed genuinely interested in the stories behind the symptoms. She remembered him as quietly brilliant, with an observational way of seeing people that felt almost artistic. He'd planned to pursue therapy too, but somewhere during their final semester he'd switched paths, talking about opening a bookstore instead. "Books heal too," he'd said when she'd expressed surprise. Just differently. His text was simple. Heard about your mom through Jamie Martinez. I know we haven't talked in forever, but I wanted you to know I'm thinking of you. No need to respond unless you want to. Jasmine stared at the message for a long time. Jamie must have mentioned it. She was the only mutual friend they'd stayed in touch with, though Jasmine had been avoiding her calls too. Most people who reached out wanted her to talk about her feelings, to process her grief, to work through her pain as if it were a problem to be solved. But Darius's message felt different. It asked for nothing. She started typing several responses, then deleted each one. What could she say? That she was barely holding on? That she felt like she was failing everyone who counted on her? That some days she forgot to eat because the simple act of caring for herself felt overwhelming? Instead, she wrote, "Thank you. That means a lot." His response came an hour later. "I have a bookstore now in the Arts District. River and Prose. If you ever want to sit somewhere quiet, you're welcome anytime. I make terrible coffee, but the books don't judge." Despite everything, Jasmine found herself almost smiling. That was so Darius, offering something specific and low pressure, adding just enough humor to keep it light. Over the next week, his text lingered in her mind. She found herself thinking about it during difficult sessions, imagining a quiet space filled with books and terrible coffee. On the following Friday, after a particularly draining day involving a custody case and 2 crisis interventions, she found herself driving toward the Arts District instead of home. River and Prose was tucked between a pottery studio and a vintage clothing shop, its large windows glowing warm against the early evening darkness. Through the glass, she could see shelves lined with books, comfortable reading chairs scattered throughout, and soft lighting that made everything look like a haven. Darius was behind the counter, his dark hair longer than she remembered, wearing a worn cardigan that looked like it had been through countless readings. He looked up when the door chimed and his face brightened with genuine warmth. Not the forced cheerfulness people had been giving her, but something real and unguarded. "Jasmine," he said softly, stepping around the counter. "I'm so glad you came." She stood awkwardly near the entrance, suddenly unsure why she'd come. "I was just in the neighborhood. Thought I'd see your terrible coffee." He smiled, and she remembered how his smiles always reached his eyes. "It's truly awful, but the atmosphere makes up for it, I hope." He led her to a corner near the poetry section, where 2 mismatched armchairs faced each other with a small table between them. As he prepared coffee in the back area, Jasmine looked around at the carefully curated space. Books were organized not just by genre but by mood. There was a section for rainy day reads, another for when you need hope, and one labeled for when words feel too heavy. When Darius returned with 2 steaming mugs, he settled into the chair across from her and simply waited. No questions about how she was doing, no comments about how long it had been, no attempts to fill the silence. He just sat, present and patient, as if her being there was enough. For the first time in months, Jasmine felt like she could breathe a little easier. The weight of always having the right words, the pressure of being everyone's source of strength, seemed to lift just slightly in this quiet corner of his world. "The coffee really is terrible," she said after a sip, and when Darius laughed, a warm, genuine sound, she realized she hadn't heard laughter in far too long. The breaking point, Jasmine started visiting River and Prose once a week, then twice, then whenever she could steal an hour between clients or needed somewhere to go, that wasn't her empty apartment. Darius never asked questions about her life, never pushed for conversation, never made her feel like she owed him explanations. He'd simply nod when she arrived, prepare his terrible coffee, and let her exist in his space. Sometimes she'd read, curled up in the corner chair with a book of poetry or a memoir that Darius had quietly recommended. Other times she'd just sit, watching him work, shelving books with careful attention, helping customers find exactly what they needed, moving through his space with a calm that felt like a balm to her frayed nerves. She learned things about him gradually. He'd opened the store 3 years ago after his father died, using the inheritance to create something meaningful rather than profitable. He lived in a small apartment above the shop, kept rescue plants that somehow thrived under his care, and had a way of knowing exactly which book a person needed before they knew it themselves. "How do you do that?" Jasmine asked one evening. watching him recommend a cookbook to a woman who'd come in looking for mysteries. She mentioned her daughter just moved away for college, Darius said quietly, restocking a nearby shelf. Sometimes people need to nurture something when they can't nurture who they want to. It was that kind of insight that made Jasmine feel seen in a way she hadn't experienced in years. Darius noticed the details other people missed, the way her hands shook slightly when she was particularly tired, how she always chose books with hopeful endings, that she never ordered food when she was there, just coffee. One evening in late March, he brought her a small plate of shortbread cookies with her coffee. "I didn't order these," she said. "I know, but you haven't eaten today, have you?" The gentle observation hit her like a physical blow. She looked down at the cookies, her vision blurring suddenly. When had someone last noticed if she'd eaten? When had anyone paid attention to her needs without her having to ask? "I'm fine," she started to say, the automatic response rising to her lips. "You don't have to be fine here," Darius said softly, settling into his usual chair. "Not with me." Something in his voice, the complete absence of judgment, the quiet permission to not be okay, made her chest tighten. She'd been holding everything together for so long, being strong for her clients, for her co-workers, for everyone who needed her to have answers. She began, then stopped. The words felt too big, too scary to let out. "Take your time," Darius said, and meant it. They sat in comfortable silence as the evening grew darker outside, the bookstore feeling like a world apart from everything else. Jasmine ate the cookies slowly, letting herself be cared for in this small way. With each bite, she felt something loosening inside her chest, some tightly held control beginning to fray. It was nearly closing time when she finally spoke. "My mom died," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know," Darius said gently, and Marcus left. "My husband. Ex-husband." The words came out flat, factual. Darius nodded, waiting. "Everyone keeps asking how I'm doing, and I keep saying I'm fine because that's what I do. That's who I am. I help other people through their worst moments, and I'm supposed to know how to handle my own." Her voice was starting to shake now. "But I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to be the person who needs help." "You don't have to know how," Darius said quietly. "You just have to let it happen." Jasmine looked up at him, this man who had created a sanctuary of books and terrible coffee and unconditional presence. In his eyes, she saw no expectation that she be anything other than exactly who she was in this moment. Broken, exhausted, lost. "I'm falling apart," she whispered, the words coming out like a confession, like a secret she'd been keeping even from herself. Darius leaned forward slightly, his voice steady and sure. "Then let me hold the pieces." The simple offer broke something open inside her chest. Tears came then. Not the careful, controlled tears she'd allowed herself in private, but deep, shaking sobs that seemed to come from somewhere she'd forgotten existed. Darius moved to the arm of her chair, not touching but close enough that she could feel his steady presence, his quiet strength. "I don't know how to let someone do that," she said through her tears. "We'll figure it out together," he promised. And for the first time since her world had crumbled, Jasmine believed that maybe, somehow, she didn't have to carry everything alone. Learning to be held, the morning after Jasmine's breaking point, she woke with the particular rawness that comes after deep crying, her eyes swollen, her chest tender, but also somehow lighter. For the first time in months, she'd slept through the night without dreams of her mother or anxiety about work. She found a text from Darius waiting on her phone. "Bookstore opens at 10. Terrible coffee ready whenever you are. No pressure." She showed up at 10:15 with real coffee from the cafe down the street. 2 cups, both prepared the way she'd noticed he liked his during their evening conversations. It was a small gesture, but it felt monumental to her. For so long, she'd been the one receiving care from others professionally while refusing it personally. Bringing him coffee felt like a first tentative step toward reciprocity. "You didn't have to," Darius said when she offered him the cup, but his smile suggested he understood the significance of the gesture. "Your coffee really is terrible," Jasmine replied, and they both laughed. Over the following weeks, Jasmine began to learn what it meant to be held without being fixed. Darius never tried to counsel her or offer solutions to her grief. Instead, he held space for her feelings without trying to change them. When she had bad days, and there were many, he didn't ask what was wrong or suggest she should feel better. He simply adjusted his presence to meet her where she was. On days when talking felt impossible, he'd bring her tea and books, letting her exist in his space without expectation. When she was angry, at Marcus for leaving, at her mother for dying, at herself for not being stronger, he listened without trying to talk her out of her feelings. When guilt overwhelmed her about not being present for her clients, he gently reminded her that healing wasn't linear for anyone, including therapists. "You know what your clients would tell you if they saw you being this hard on yourself?" he asked one afternoon when she'd been particularly self-critical. Jasmine considered this. "They'd probably tell me to be gentler with myself." And they'd be right. Slowly, Jasmine began to accept small acts of care. Darius would text her reminders to eat lunch, not nagging but gentle check-ins that someone was thinking of her. He started keeping snacks she liked in the bookstore, never making a show of it but ensuring they were available when she needed them. When she mentioned missing her mother's cooking, he quietly learned to make her favorite soup, having it ready on days when she seemed particularly fragile. "You don't have to take care of me," Jasmine protested one evening when he presented her with a perfectly prepared bowl of her mother's lentil soup recipe. "I'm not taking care of you," Darius said, settling across from her with his own bowl. "I'm just being present while you take care of yourself. There's a difference." She was beginning to understand that difference. He wasn't trying to rescue her or solve her problems. He was simply creating conditions where she felt safe enough to tend to her own healing. Their relationship deepened through these quiet moments. Jasmine found herself sharing memories of her mother, not the sanitized versions she'd offered at the funeral, but real stories full of complexity and love. She talked about her fears that she wasn't good enough at her job, her worry that she'd lost herself somewhere in the process of being everyone's strength. Darius shared, too, gradually, about losing his father, about the loneliness of running a business, about his own struggles with feeling like he'd disappointed people by choosing books over psychology. Their conversations wove together their separate wounds and hopes, creating something stronger than either could build alone. One evening in early May, Jasmine arrived at the bookstore to find Darius had closed early and was sitting in the poetry section with takeout from her favorite Thai restaurant. "What's this?" she asked. "It's been 2 months since you first told me you were falling apart," he said simply. "I thought we should mark the fact that you're still here, still healing, still letting yourself be held." As they ate pad Thai among the poetry books, Jasmine realized something had shifted fundamentally. She no longer felt like she was drowning in her own life. The grief was still there. It probably always would be, but it no longer threatened to consume her entirely. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for teaching me that being held doesn't make me weak." "You taught yourself that," Darius replied. "I just provided the space for you to learn." Rebuilding together by summer, Jasmine had learned to recognize the difference between being alone and being lonely. Her apartment, while still sparsely furnished, no longer felt like a tomb, but rather like a blank canvas she could slowly, carefully fill with things that mattered to her. She'd started cooking again, not elaborate meals, but simple, nourishing food that she ate mindfully rather than mechanically. At work, she'd finally accepted Patricia's suggestion to see her own therapist. It felt strange sitting on the other side of the couch, being the one guided through processing rather than doing the guiding. But with Darius's gentle encouragement, she'd started to extend herself the same compassion she offered her clients. "Healing looks different on everyone," she told her therapist, Dr. Reeves, during one session. "I spent so long thinking I had to do it perfectly, the same way I help others heal. But maybe my path looks different." Her relationship with Darius had evolved too, so gradually she almost didn't notice it happening. Their evening conversations had grown longer, more intimate. She'd started arriving earlier, helping him close the shop, learning the rhythms of his world just as he'd learned hers. There were moments now when their hands would brush as they reached for the same book, when their eyes would meet across the store with shared understanding, when the space between them felt charged with possibility. One evening in late June, Jasmine was helping Darius reorganize the memoir section when she found herself really looking at him, the way his brow furrowed slightly when he concentrated, how he handled each book with reverence, the quiet strength in his movements. When he glanced up and caught her staring, neither of them looked away. "Jasmine," he said softly, her name a question in his voice. She moved closer, close enough to see the gold flecks in his dark eyes. "I think," she said carefully, "I think I'm ready to be held in a different way." He reached up to touch her face gently, his thumb brushing across her cheekbone. "Are you sure?" "There's no rush. We have all the time in the world." "I'm sure," she whispered, and meant it completely. Their first kiss was tender and unhurried, full of months of built trust and patient care. When they broke apart, Jasmine felt something she hadn't experienced since before her mother died, a sense of wholeness that came not from being completed by someone else, but from being known and accepted exactly as she was. "I love you," Darius said simply, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "I love you too," Jasmine replied, surprised by how easy it was to say, how right it felt. They didn't rush into anything. Jasmine kept her apartment, maintaining her independence even as their lives intertwined more deeply. But slowly she started keeping clothes at his place, cooking dinner in his small kitchen above the bookstore, falling asleep in his arms among the scent of old books and fresh coffee. 6 months later, Jasmine stood in River and Prose on a quiet Sunday morning, watching Darius help a young woman find books about grieving a parent. She recognized the look in the woman's eyes, the same fragmented desperation she'd carried when she first stumbled into this space. "Grief isn't something you get over," she heard Darius tell the woman gently. "It's something you learn to carry differently." Jasmine smiled, remembering when she'd believed that needing support meant failure, when being held felt like surrender. Now she understood that love, real, lasting love, wasn't about being saved or fixed. It was about being seen completely and accepted fully, about creating space for each other to heal and grow and become. That evening, as they closed the shop together, Darius pulled her close. "You know what I realized today?" Jasmine said, settling into his embrace. "What's that?" "I spent so long thinking that falling apart meant I was broken. But maybe falling apart was just making space for something better to grow." Darius kissed the top of her head, his arms tightening around her. "Maybe," he said quietly. "Falling apart was just your way of coming home." Outside, summer rain began to fall on the quiet street, but inside River and Prose, surrounded by books and terrible coffee and the man who had taught her how to be held, Jasmine Rivera finally understood that she was exactly where she belonged.